Let me tell y'all something right now. The world done seen a lot of diplomacy, a lot of suits, ties, flashbulbs, and soft talking behind closed doors. But what just happened, that ain't diplomacy, that was fireworks. That was truth served hot. That was a moment in history where a man, Dr. S. Jaishankar, stood on a global stage, looked hypocrisy dead in the face, and hit it with a beat, a lyric, a message so bold it had the whole world spinning like a Michael Jackson moonwalk. And he didn't even need a microphone drop. His words did the damage. See, you know what happens when a man's patience runs out, when he been quiet for too long, when he been nodding along, smiling politely, taking the punches, shaking hands while biting his tongue. One day he stops playing. One day the gloves come off, and when that man is from a nation that's been underestimated, underappreciated, and constantly judged by a rulebook nobody else follows, oh, he gonna light a fire. That's what Jaishankar just did. Now picture this room full of reporters, diplomats, global elites. Everybody got their coffee, their notepads, their polite questions. And then somebody throws that tired old jab. What about India's stance? Why is India not aligning with the West on this issue? Why won't India condemn so? And so, why are you buying oil from them? Why are you still friends with Russia? Why do you talk to China? And Jaishankar, he don't flinch. He don't back down, he smiles, he listens, and then he leans in and says, "You ever heard the song Man in the Mirror by Michael Jackson?" Silence. What? Did he just say Michael Jackson? Yes, he did. Because while y'all out here quoting global indexes and political think tanks, Jaishankar just reached into the soul of the conversation. He didn't bring policy. He brought poetry. He didn't bring aggression. He brought reflection. That line, "I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his ways." That wasn't a lyric anymore. That was a mirror being held up to the West. See, that's the brilliance. He wasn't just dropping a pop icon. He was flipping the whole narrative. You asking me why India doesn't bend to your script, why India doesn't follow your dance moves. Brother, maybe you need to look at yourself first. Maybe before you question my nation's friendships, you need to audit your own. Let's talk about that mirror, because ain't nobody want to look in it. The U.S. talks about freedom and democracy like it invented it. But go ask Iraq what freedom felt like. Go ask Libya what democracy brought. Go ask Afghanistan how many promises were kept when the last helicopter lifted off. And yet they point fingers at India for doing business with Russia. India, a country that needs energy security, food stability, border safety, and economic growth. India, a country that didn't colonize, didn't invade, didn't bomb, just trying to grow its people, lift them out of poverty, build smart cities, fuel its economy, and now you want to judge. Jaishankar was saying, if you gone judge, start with your own track record. Don't come to me with lectures while your own backyard's burning. Don't play moral preacher while you out here making deals under the table with nations you publicly shame. You want to talk transparency? Let's pull up the receipts. You want to talk alliances? Let's talk about the regimes you funded, the dictators you called strategic partners, the invasions you labeled as interventions. And it wasn't anger in his voice. It was truth. Cold, calm, and surgical. That kind of clarity that don't come from notes. That comes from experience. That comes from a man who's seen the chessboard from all angles. A man who knows India used to be told, stand here, sit there, sign this, say that, but not anymore. This is a new India. This is an India that won't be shamed into submission. This is an India that's finding its voice and using it. An India that isn't afraid to quote Michael Jackson in a room full of people wearing power ties and masks of moral superiority. Because sometimes it takes the simplest lyric to expose the deepest hypocrisy. Now let's break down the brilliance of that reference. Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror ain't just a song. It's a message about change starting from within. It's about owning your flaws, fixing your house before throwing shade on someone else's. Jaishankar wasn't throwing shade. He was turning on the light. He said, "We are buying oil at a discount because it serves our people. We are talking to multiple powers because we are sovereign. We're not here to pick sides. We're here to survive, to thrive, and to stay true to our national interest." And the room. They didn't know whether to applaud or panic because they realized something. This ain't the India of the 90s. This ain't the India that says yes just to be liked. This is the India that'll look you in the eye and say, "We'll do what's best for us, and we'll do it with dignity." The media tried to spin it. India refuses to pick sides. No, India picked the side of its people. India picked the side of strategic autonomy. India picked the side of common sense. What you mad about? That India didn't sign your piece of paper, that India didn't join your little club, or that India's rising without your approval. This is what burns them up. The fact that India, once known for outsourcing, is now out maneuvering. The fact that India ain't just listening anymore, it's leading. And they can't figure out how a man can stand up in a room full of Western pressure and quote a song from an American pop legend and still make them feel exposed. That, my friends, is what you call poetic justice, and let's not ignore the symbolism. Michael Jackson was a global icon, beloved in every corner of the world. His message transcended language, race, and borders. So when Jaishankar quoted him, he wasn't appealing to America. He was appealing to the conscience of the world. He was saying, we all got mirrors. Some of y'all just scared to look. They thought India would fold, that the pressure would be too much. Sanctions here, warnings there, phone calls from presidents, tweets from foreign ministries. And yet India stood tall, calm, firm, and unapologetic. And the truth is, India didn't need to be loud. Because when your foundation is strong, your silence screams louder than speeches. Jaishankar proved that. He ain't need to rant. He ain't need to raise his voice. He just let the facts do the talking. He showed the world that wisdom ain't in the volume, it's in the value. Now let me tell you what the West can't handle right now. They can't handle that their old tools don't work anymore. You see, they used to pull out words like human rights, global norms, rules, based order, and expect the rest of the world to tremble. But today, those words ring hollow when they come from mouths that ignored war crimes in their own backyard, when they kept silent about suffering if it didn't fit their agenda. India saw that. Jaishankar called it out. He said, in essence, you want us to follow your rules, but your rules change depending on who's breaking them. You invaded nations and called it liberation. We trade with a neighbor, and you call it betrayal. You armed regimes with billions and still call yourselves peacekeepers. Come on now. That don't even sound right. See, this is what real leadership looks like. It's not just about defending your country. It's about defining your country. And right now, India is defining itself as independent, assertive, and aware. No longer reactive, no longer submissive, and Jaishankar, he's the voice of that shift. A diplomat who can quote Shakespeare and Bruce Lee in one breath and Michael Jackson in the next. That's versatility. That's power. Because while others use politics to confuse, he uses culture to clarify. He's making it plain, relatable, and real. And let's not forget, when Jaishankar speaks, it's not just for India. It's for every country that's been told to stay in line, for every nation that's been handed an instruction manual on how to behave, for every leader who's been gaslit into silence. When he said, look at the man in the mirror, what he really said was, stop pretending to be shocked by our independence. Start being honest about your double standards. That takes guts. because we know what happens to those who speak truth to power. They get targeted, criticized, twisted in headlines, but Jaishankar don't flinch. He been through it. He been in the rooms where eyes roll when India speaks up. But now those eyes, they watching closely. Because India ain't whispering no more. India is roaring, and don't mistake calmness for weakness. Don't confuse diplomacy with obedience. India doesn't need permission to grow, doesn't need validation to act, and it sure don't need lectures from those who write rules with invisible ink. This moment, this quote, this man in the mirror reference, it's going down in history, not just because it was clever, but because it was correct. Because it flipped the table without flipping the room, because it reminded the world, your power ain't in your accusations, it's in your actions, and if your actions don't match your preaching, then baby, that mirror gone tell the truth. So here we are, the new chapter, the new tone, the new frequency. India ain't dancing to somebody else's music. It's composing its own, and it ain't afraid to sample some MJ while doing it. The world better get ready, because when a nation finds its rhythm, finds its voice, and finds leaders bold enough to speak that truth through global noise, there ain't no stopping that rise. They thought they could control the tempo, but now they realizing India brought the beat. Jaishankar didn't challenge the West to fight, but to finally look in the mirror, and that one move, that one gesture, turned the entire narrative upside down. See, for decades, the global power game was built on confrontation. Who's got more weapons, more allies, more sanctions, more influence? But Jaishankar flipped that whole model on its head. He didn't step onto the stage to escalate. He didn't point fingers and demand apologies. No, he just did something far more devastating. He asked the world to pause, reflect, and evaluate itself. And that, right there, is what terrified the West more than any missile or economic retaliation. Because when someone asks you to look in the mirror, it's not a threat. It's not a debate. It's an invitation to honesty. And honesty in global politics is the one thing nobody wants to talk about. Nations thrive on narratives. They build their legitimacy on selective storytelling. But a mirror, that's a different beast. A mirror don't care about how pretty your speeches sound or how shiny your credentials are. A mirror shows the truth, unfiltered, uncomfortable, unavoidable, and when Jaishankar, standing in front of journalists and policymakers, made that cultural reference to Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror, he wasn't being cute, he was being strategic. He knew what he was doing. He knew that invoking a global cultural icon like Michael Jackson wasn't about entertainment. It was about exposure. That song wasn't just a throwaway quote. It was a laser-guided missile pointed directly at the core of Western foreign policy hypocrisy. The West has long held itself as the standard, bearer of morality, democracy, and order. But what happens when the one they're trying to lecture turns the spotlight around and asks, "Before you criticize me, have you examined yourself?" That's what Jaishankar did. And he did it without shouting, without condescension, without aggression. That's the genius. He used a lyric to slice through decades of layered hypocrisy, because let's be honest, the West loves to lecture. On human rights, on freedom, on global norms, but those lectures fall flat when they come from nations with long records of violating those same ideals in the name of national interest. You bomb countries in the name of democracy. You support coups and call them strategic. You apply sanctions selectively and pretend it's about justice. Jaishankar didn't say those things out loud. He didn't have to. That's what the mirror is for. The mirror doesn't accuse, it reveals, and when he subtly suggested that Western nations take a look at themselves, he held up that mirror for all to see. He forced a moment of silence. He turned scrutiny inward. And the brilliance of it, nobody could deny the message because he didn't package it in confrontation. He packaged it in self-reflection. That's what made it powerful. The world wasn't used to this kind of diplomacy. They were used to either submissive silence or angry retaliation, but this was elegant resistance. This was poetic accountability, and it rattled people because it set a new tone, a tone where India no longer justifies its sovereignty. It asserts it where India no longer plays defense against Western narratives. It dismantles them with surgical precision. Jaishankar made it clear, India will not pick sides in someone else's geopolitical game. It will not be bullied into binary choices. It will not accept lectures from those who have refused to learn from their own mistakes. And the mirror, the mirror, made that message sting. Because once the mirror is up, it becomes very hard to pretend. Very hard to moralize, very hard to deflect. Suddenly, people start remembering uncomfortable things. Iraq, Libya, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Pinochet, the Shah, Guantanamo Bay, the list goes on. Every one of those is a crack in the moral armor the West loves to wear. Jaishankar didn't need to recite that history. He simply reminded them it exists, that the record is public, that hypocrisy doesn't go away just because you change the subject. And what made it sting even more was that it came from someone who has spent his entire career understanding the system. Jaishankar isn't an outsider throwing rocks. He's a seasoned player who knows the game, the rulebook, and the hidden clauses the West uses to justify its every move. He's been in the back rooms. He's heard the whispers. He's studied the patterns, and so when he speaks, it's not out of naivety. It's with the clarity of a man who's read all the fine print and chosen not to sign blindly. That's why the mirror moment hit differently. Because it wasn't just aimed at governments. It was aimed at the entire machinery of Western narrative control. The media, the think tanks, the influencers who act like referees while wearing team jerseys. He said, in effect, stop pretending to be neutral while stacking the deck. Stop demanding transparency while hiding your own playbook. Stop telling us to behave like you, when we've seen exactly how you behave. That's not a fight. That's not a confrontation. That's accountability. And accountability is what the world has been starved of. For years, smaller nations have been gaslit into silence. Every time they raised concerns, they were told to focus on development. Every time they charted independent paths, they were accused of undermining global order. But who defined that order, who built it on loopholes and exceptions, who enforced it only when it suited their interests? The mirror revealed all of that, and that's why it wasn't just India that applauded Jaishankar's words. All across the global south, diplomats, scholars, and ordinary citizens felt the weight of that moment. Because it gave voice to what many had been thinking but couldn't say. That maybe it's time we stopped letting the self-declared referees of the world dictate what's right and wrong. That maybe it's time we stop accepting moral guidance from those who can't even admit their own contradictions. The West has been used to leading the conversation. They ask the questions, they frame the context. They decide what gets highlighted and what gets ignored. But Jaishankar, he flipped the lens. He reframed the conversation. He made the questioners question themselves. He introduced a new kind of diplomacy, one that doesn't demand respect, but earns it, one that doesn't echo the old narratives, but writes new ones. And that's why the mirror is such a powerful tool, because once it's up, it can't be unseen. Once the hypocrisy is named, it can't be unnamed. Once the rules are exposed as selective, the whole game starts to unravel. And what you're left with is something far more powerful than dominance, truth. Truth doesn't shout, it doesn't boast. It just stands there, quietly wrecking everything built on pretense. Jaishankar used that truth like a scalpel. He didn't challenge the West to a brawl. He didn't throw verbal punches. He just opened the blinds and let the sunlight in, and that light was enough to make a lot of people squint, shift uncomfortably, and reconsider their approach. That's leadership, because real leadership doesn't need to dominate. It needs to elevate. It needs to bring clarity, not chaos. And by turning the conversation from accusation to reflection, Jaishankar showed the world what mature diplomacy looks like. Not the kind that seeks applause, the kind that seeks alignment with reality, and it worked. Suddenly, the headlines shifted, the narrative cracked. People started asking the right questions, not just about India's decisions, but about their own, about who gets to moralize and why, about what it means to be sovereign in a world that punishes independence, about whether the loudest voices in the room are always the wisest. And that's when you realize the true impact of that mirror. It didn't just challenge Western hypocrisy, it liberated everyone else. It gave permission to think differently, speak boldly, act independently. It set a precedent. If India can stand tall and reject the shame game, why can't others? If India can prioritize its national interest without apology, why should others apologize for doing the same? The mirror became a symbol of that shift. Because in the end, the world doesn't need another Cold War. It doesn't need more us versus them rhetoric. It needs honesty, balance, mutual respect. It needs nations to grow up and stop pretending that the old ways of power still hold moral weight. It needs mirrors, not megaphones. Reflection, not projection.